In this video, we're going to take a look at what conditions led to the establishment of democracy in South Africa. So kind of what happened in those last 15 years that finally led to the negotiations and democracy. And 1976 is a key turning point in this struggle. In between the Rivonia trial and 1976, we get a new generation of black youth led by Steve Biko. And he forms the Black Consciousness movement, which is a pride in black culture, black power culture. All the way up until 1976, this is getting a little bit more strong. And then it really culminates in the Soweto uprising. 20,000 students walk out of their Soweto school, so this is a township outside of Johannesburg. So they walk outside of their school in protest of the Bantu education system's introduction of Afrikaans as the official language of instruction. So all instruction is not going to be in the Afrikaans language. And they weren't too happy because Afrikaans was associated with apartheid. So they wanted English, but this was seen as kind of giving in to the language of the oppressor. So 20,000 students walking in the streets, protesting. The police open fire to stop the protesters. And this leads to a larger riot, and it's a riot for several nights. According to the government, 176 people are killed. According to protester records, however, 700 people are killed. So there's a large disparity on how many people actually died in these riots and in the police reaction. As a result of this, thousands of people leave the country to train in MK camps. This is the turning point in which it's going to start to get much more violent. Many people are arrested. Steve Biko is arrested and murdered by police while in prison. The government reaction is no more black consciousness organizations. Police are allowed to imprison any suspect without trial, so habeas corpus is gone. And all young white men are required to serve 2 years military service, so they start a draft for all young white men. A new constitution is set up, trying to kind of give in a little bit, but not very much. So it's the illusion of power here. They're going to set up a 3-chamber parliament, but 2 of those chambers are still going to be white. And those 2 white chambers can always outvote this new Indian and colored chamber, which will be given. So whites still have the majority, so not much is changing. It's just giving a little bit, but not much. And this sparks a whole lot of protest because of those problems. The United Democratic Front is formed as a non-racial organization, so a new organization pops up to protest, the United Democratic Front. And this encourages people to reject the new constitution. Only 20% of the newly eligible Indian and colored voters even participate in this 1984 election. Black trade unions joined the UDF to start to organize boycotts, and a lot of the smaller units formed together to create one big group, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU, which is going to be important for the rest of this unit. So all the unions are kind of represented with COSATU. Blacks are not included in this constitution because under the Bantustan laws, they are not citizens. They are part of the Bantustans and are not South African citizens. And so in protest to this constitution, in protest to Soweto, the uprising continues and violence continues. A state of emergency is eventually declared and the army is sent in to patrol the townships. For the next several years, it's an official state of emergency under military rule. Thousands are killed in these protests, but the rebellion keeps on going. And so going back a little here, you can kind of see the white parliament still controlling the others, so it's not true democracy here. In 1989, these protest groups, the UDF and the COSATU, they get together, and so the protesters and the union forms the Mass Democratic Movement, and from here on out, they'll be working together to launch this national defiance campaign, working together. So they're going to do things like they were doing back in the 50s, ignoring banning orders, forcing segregated buildings to open, going into, so blacks are going to go into the whites-only areas. And they start to fly the flag of the African National Congress again, even though it's illegal. And they start to march in the streets once more, despite military coming in and often killing people. And so the government starts to back off a bit, and stops using the military to always respond, and they take no action as the people start to break apartheid laws. 1990, National Party President F.W. de Klerk announces major reforms. So he's going to bring in a whole lot of changes trying to calm everybody down because it's just constant chaos in the 1980s. So the African National Congress is no longer banned, it's back in. All political prisoners will be released, no more death penalty, and the government officially signals they're ready to negotiate with the ANC. And so he's trying to appeal to white voters, bringing in these reforms, hoping to get the rest of the world to come back in and invest again. It's going to be 4 years of nasty violence and negotiation before settlement is reached. 15,000 people will die in the process of just political violence on both sides. And both sides have different visions of what the future should be. The African National Congress wants majority rule because, well, they are the majority, but they want true democracy where they can show that. They also want a new constitution created by democratically elected constituent assemblies, so they want to write the constitution. The National Party wants a power-sharing government so that they are still protected, because they're going to be outnumbered as only 10% of the population. So they want a new government where they still have a part in that government, where there's still minority rights for whites. Opening talks are in Cape Town of May 1990, and they're going to discuss many of the obstacles before they can. So this is the discussion on how they can start the discussion. And so they talk about certain things such as the state of emergency, which still existed, the military was still in charge. What about the political prisoners like Mandela? What about ending the MK armed struggle, so stopping terrorist attacks? What about allowing exiles like Oliver Tambo back in? How are they going to really end the economic sanctions? And so they agreed to start to work on all these things in the Groot Sure Minute, where they kind of come to consensus that we're going to work on these things so we can start to talk. And so they meet again in the Pretoria Minute, another round of talks in Pretoria, 1990 in August. The ANC decides no more armed struggle. The MK will no longer commit any acts of terrorism. In exchange, the NP lifts the state of emergency. Both sides put their guns down, which is a huge step forward. A little while later, 1 year later, they meet again at the December 1991 Convention for a Democratic South Africa, CODESA. They meet at their World Trade Center at Kempton Park, just outside Johannesburg. 300 delegates meet, representing 19 different groups. But it's really a talk between the ANC and the National Party. They're going to dominate these talks. And so it's boycotted by some parties, such as the Pan-African Congress on the left and the Conservative Party on the right. So the extremist parties don't want to have these talks. They want to keep fighting. But those in the center, they're ready to negotiate. And so they come to another agreement. They're going to set up a new constitution in a two-stage process. On part one, they'll have a big conference to create a interim government, kind of a government in between while they finish up. Part two, which is the first elected parliament will use this first government as the draft to create a new final draft, a new constitution. So they're going to do this in 2 stages. However, these negotiations are going to break down several times due to, most often, violence. Due to the economic situation, extreme poverty and unemployment are hitting the townships hard. And so pretty nasty unemployment in most areas, 30–40% for black unemployment. And the people are impatient for change. These are long, slow talks, and the people are getting violent and impatient. And so we get a lot of violence, in this case, between black groups. The African National Congress and the Zulu Intaka are fighting and killing each other. The Intaka is a Zulu cultural organization that eventually becomes a political party, the Intaka Freedom Party. And they promote Zulu nationalism, creating a new Zulu country. And they do this by dressing traditional dress, but also carrying around traditional weapons. So they're walking in the streets with spears and clubs, and sometimes they actually use them. So spears and knob carriers, which I believe is this club here. And very strong in their own Zulu homeland of KwaZulu-Natal. And we get a few acts of violence. Zulu immigrant workers clash with township residents near Johannesburg. And in some cases, there's this mysterious third force, where it's this, there's a lot of theories that the government was supporting and hoping that they could get these two black groups to turn on each other And so this was known as the third force, where it was actually true. The government was found providing weapons, military training, and money to the Zulu to help fight the ANC, to help split them apart further. And this really threatens the peace talks when the government's going behind the back to encourage violence between black groups. And so we get more violence. ANC protesters are shot by the police in Sebokeng Township. And so the first talks in 1990 were called off as the government was forced to make concessions before talks could even begin because the police killed protesters again. And so they were forced to stop talking for a bit, and the government agreed to send out judges to figure out exactly what happened and investigate. 1992, talks break down again because of increased violence and fears that it's going to break down into a civil war. In May, the ANC breaks off negotiations. In June, the Zulu and Taka supporters, backed by the police, this third force, attack ANC members attending a funeral near Johannesburg. Dozens are killed, mostly women and children are killed at a funeral. ANC demands and receives a commission to investigate police involvement, and they find a report that this was true. The police, again, were helping the Zulu to attack the ANC, and the ANC attack right back. So in this case, we have a man being burnt alive by ANC supporters. So it's back and forth. It's getting real bloody. And this threatens the talks. The ANC, the South African Communist Party, and the Cosatu unions, they launch more protest, a rolling mass action involving strikes and demonstrations. September 92, Bisho, which is the capital of the Ciskei homeland. Soldiers open fire on a peaceful demonstration. So here are the protesters, here are the police, and here are the results. And so this kills several, wounds at least 200 people are shot. The ANC and other parties accuse the government of stirring up conflict again so that the National Party would benefit. So the talks are not going well. They're continuing with very much anger and suspicion as they keep killing each other. But we start to get closer and closer. Western governments start to put pressure on the government and the ANC to resume talks. The United States and the rest of the United Nations start to push them. UN sends in observers to investigate all these forms of violence. And the Bisho massacre starts to help both sides realize they need to start talking again to stop this violence. So, they start up again. September 1992, party leaders signal they signed a record of understanding to resume the work they started at CODESA. This is kind of their big chance. And so here's a little cartoon saying they still want to talk, and this is their chance for those white South Africans to save them because everything's on fire. And so they've given a little bit to push those negotiations forward again. So they make some concessions. And this is the big breakthrough to start the talks again, known as the Sunset Clauses. And this is proposed by Joe Slovo, the leader of the South African Communist Party. The National Party will release all political prisoners that they hadn't released already. And all Intaka rallies will no longer be allowed to have those traditional weapons. So you can't bring spears to a public rally anymore. The African National Congress will give in. They will agree to this government of national unity, including the National Party, for the first 5 years. So the first 5 years, whites will have a part in this government, regardless of whatever the election has. Plus, they will honor the existing contracts of members of the civil service, judiciary, police, and defense force. So the police, the army, they're going to last. They're going to stick around for the first 5 years. April 93, it screws up again. Chris Hani, a communist leader, he was popular in the MK, he was popular in the African National Congress, popular in the Communist Party. He is killed by an anti-communist Polish immigrant, Janusz Walus, with a gun that was supplied by a member of the conservative White Party. And so this breaks things down again, where somebody on the white side is killing a top black leader. And this leads to more demonstrations, increased racial tensions, more mistrust. And before everybody starts to go crazy again, Mandela gets on TV to make another speech to prevent further violence. He pleads with all African people to not fight again. And it really shows how much power he has. Even though he's not president, he's already making speeches and influencing people. And then there's these guys, the white side of the violence, the Afrikaners. And so there are many violent attempts by the Afrikaner white ring to prevent a power-sharing government. They don't want to give up any of that power. So over 200 paramilitary and fundamentalist white groups are popping up across the country. But the biggest and scary group is the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging, the Afrikaner Resistance Group, the AWB. They wanted to maintain white supremacy, and they carry out many acts of violence. And so it's almost like an offshoot of the Nazi Party here. August 1991, the AWB confronts police in Vendersdorp, where F.W. de Klerk was defending his policy of reform. So the president is talking at a rally, and the AWB attack the police. 4 are killed in the confrontation. And this is their main leader, Eugene Terreblanche, right here. June 1993, hundreds of AW members stormed the World Trade Center in Johannesburg in an armored car and assault the delegates trying to get to the talks. And so this is another photo of the AWB showing up and breaking windows. It's actually a broken window there. Breaking windows to get into the building in an attempt to stop the negotiations once more. Okay. We also get a bomb blast targeting political party offices and voting venues. They start to just do political acts of violence here. Days before the 1994 election, 5,000 AWB members invade the Botswana homeland and shoot at civilians. Even on election day, 1994, a bomb goes off at Johannesburg airport. So they're committing many acts of terrorism. But wait, there's more. Violent attacks are also being taken place by the Azanian People's Liberation Army, which is the extremist armed wing of the Pan-African Congress. They're going out, killing civilians with handguns, throwing grenades, but eventually the pack does start to break down and back off when they start to see progress. Buthelezi is the leader of the Zulu in Taka, and he refused to negotiate for quite a while, and even threatened to boycott the 1994 election. He wants an independent country, an independent Zulu homeland under Intaka control. 1 month before the election, ANC and Intaka supporters are clashed, 53 dead, many wounded again. Despite the violence of these negotiations, they were making progress. They set a date for an election to include all South Africans over the age of 18. November 1993, they agree on an interim constitution with the existing tricameral parliament, and they set up a transitional executive council with representatives from all sides established to oversee the process leading to the election. So everybody's agreeing we're going to have an election, everybody's going to watch, and we have a government ready to go. Despite their opposition to reform, a lot of the right-wing Afrikaners will participate in the election by forming a new party, the Freedom Front political party. So they're kind of angry with de Klerk, so they go off and form their own tiny little angry white party, the Freedom Front. The ANC forms an alliance with the South African Communist Party and the trade unions, so they form one big party instead of having individual parties. Old ties to the South African Communist Party, with many of the ANC members claiming membership with the South African Communist, even Mandela. And so even though the ANC never really adopted communist policies, they had close ties for a long time. Finally, here's a little picture of this agreement. The Intaka agreed to be a part of the election, and they agreed after an emergency meeting between Mandela, de Klerk, and Buthelezi. There was worry that this would just lead to more violence if they weren't part of the election, if they weren't part of the process. So here's the big election. It takes a couple days because a lot of people are going to have to travel, and a lot of people are voting for the first time, so they're not sure how many people are going to show up. And so here's a famous picture of a long line of everybody exercising their right to vote, waiting hours and hours, possibly days, just for the right to vote. This is their first democratic election based on universal suffrage. Before this election, 90% of the population wasn't allowed to vote. It's largely peaceful except for a few bombings here and there by white Afrikaners. The UN observers declared that these elections are free and fair, although there were some doubts about the elections in the Zulu homeland. The ANC alliance gets 63% of the votes, a clear majority. They win a majority in 7 of 9 provinces. The only places they don't win are in, the NP wins 20% and a majority in the Western Cape, which is a more white-dominated area. And then Taka wins 11% and a majority in their Zulu homeland. But overall, the ANC wins, and here's Mandela voting, and Mandela winning. And so that was kind of the path on how they got democracy.